There's a moment, and I think most people who have spent real time out in deep space know exactly what I'm talking about, where you stop being afraid of the dark. Not because you get brave, not because you get used to it, but because something worse comes along, and suddenly the dark feels like home. I hit that moment on Relay Station Vorath 9, about 6 weeks into what was supposed to be a routine archival assignment. And I want to tell you exactly what happened there. Not the sanitized version the Galactic Oversight Committee put in their report. Not the version Ambassador Krellian used in his speech to the Hegemony Council. The real version. The one that explains why 17 alien civilizations, some of them thousands of years older than humanity, stopped what they were doing and held their collective breath. The one that explains what woke up. And more importantly, why it was our fault. My name is Dara Vasquez. I was 31 years old when this happened. I had a master's degree in xenoarchaeological linguistics from the University of Sao Paulo, a mid-level clearance with the Terran Archaeological Survey Bureau, and absolutely zero business being anywhere near what we found in that station. I'd been stationed at Vorath 9 for about 40 days when things started going wrong. Let me set the scene for you because this place matters. Relay Station Vorath 9 wasn't built by humans. It wasn't built by any species currently active in the hegemony either. It was one of maybe 24 known precursor installations, those ancient, impossible structures left behind by whoever came before everyone. The ones no one can fully date. The ones that make the oldest Veth scholars go quiet and stare at their hands when you ask them what they think built them. The station was about the size of a small moon, not spherical, just roughly that mass. It looked like someone had taken a city, turned it inside out, and then left it floating between two dead stars for long enough that the cold had settled into every corridor like a living thing. The architecture was wrong in ways that took time to notice. Hallways that curved slightly too much. Ceilings that changed height when you weren't paying attention. Rooms that appeared on the internal sensors but couldn't be physically accessed from any adjacent corridor. The Hegemony had established a research presence there about 40 years ago, Terran standard. By the time I arrived, the station had about 300 personnel, a mix of species, mostly Veth xenolinguists, a handful of Drakai engineers who were trying to understand the power systems, some Marathi biologists who were convinced the station's inner chambers had once been used for something biological, and about 18 humans total, mostly in survey and administrative roles. We were the new kids. Humanity had only been full hegemony members for about 60 years at that point. We were still in that phase where everyone was politely tolerant of us, but didn't fully trust our judgment. Looking back, I understand why they were careful. What I don't understand is why they didn't warn us about what was down in sublevel 19. My assignment was simple, or it was supposed to be. There was a set of wall engravings in Corridor Cluster 7 deep in the station's midsection that the Veth linguists had been making notes about for years without cracking the script. It wasn't standard precursor glyph work. It was something else layered beneath it, older, carved into the material of the walls with a technique that apparently didn't match any known tool or method. The Veth thought maybe it was ceremonial, maybe decorative. They'd cataloged it, taken readings, moved on. My job was to cross-reference those engravings against a new corpus of recovered precursor fragments found on a dig site in the Reketh Expanse. Simple comparison work, the kind of thing that takes weeks and mostly produces nothing exciting. Except, here's the thing about xenolinguistics. You spend enough time staring at a language no one speaks anymore, really staring, letting your brain sort of go loose and receptive the way it does when you stop trying too hard. And sometimes a pattern emerges that no algorithm catches because it isn't structured the way an algorithm expects. That's what happened on day 38. I was in the corridor cluster alone. Most of the research team worked the first shift, Hegemony Standard Time. I preferred the late cycle, quieter, fewer people asking questions over your shoulder. I had my portable scanner and my reference tablets, and about 4 hours of work ahead of me. I was looking at a section of engraving near the base of the wall, floor level, actually, which was weird in itself because precursor work was almost always at eye height or above, when the pattern clicked. Not the visual pattern, the mathematical pattern underneath it. I'd been running spectral frequency analysis on the engravings as part of the cross-reference protocol, and the numbers that came back had been bothering me for days in the way numbers bother you when they're familiar without being recognizable. That night, my station night cycle, when the ambient lighting dropped to about 30% and the whole corridor took on this pale blue cast. I was staring at the frequency outputs on my tablet, and I finally figured out what they reminded me of. Morse code. Not literally. Obviously, it wasn't Morse code. But the structure, short signals, long signals, grouped in clusters with clear pause intervals between groups, it had that same rhythm. Someone or something had encoded information inside the physical composition of the wall material itself. The engravings on the surface were almost decoration. The real message was in the molecular structure underneath. I sat on the floor of that corridor for about 20 minutes, just breathing. Then I did what any sensible researcher would do. I called my direct supervisor, Dr. Yuan Liang, and told him what I'd found. Yuan was a good man, careful, thorough, the kind of person who double-checked everything twice and kept immaculate notes. He came down to Corridor Cluster 7 within the hour, looked at my data, and went very still in the way that careful people go still when they're trying to decide how alarmed to be. "You're sure about the frequency clustering?" he asked. "Run it yourself," I said. I handed him the scanner. He ran it himself. He looked at the output. He handed the scanner back to me. "I'm going to need to make some calls," he said. "To who?" He hesitated just briefly. "Station administration. This kind of discovery has protocols." I didn't think much of it at the time. Research stations have protocols for everything. It's how you manage 300 people from a dozen species in a structure that was built by no one currently living. What I didn't know, what I found out much later, when the committee report eventually surfaced, was that Yuan's call went not just to station administration, but through a secure channel to a hegemony oversight body I'd never heard of. An organization called the Quorum of Sealed Records. Apparently they had standing jurisdiction over anything discovered at precursor sites that fell into certain categories. Categories that Yuan recognized, but I didn't. Because there was a word in those molecular encodings, once you ran them through the right kind of analytical framework, that appeared over and over again in clusters of 3. I didn't know what the word meant yet. None of us did, not at first. But the VETH members of the research team, when Yuan showed them the preliminary decode the next morning, I watched their faces. And I've spent enough time around VETH to know their expressions. I know what uncertainty looks like on them, and what disagreement looks like, and what professional skepticism looks like. What I saw on their faces when they looked at that word was none of those things. What I saw was fear. The word, once our translation algorithms finished processing the molecular signal against the full corpus of known precursor communication fragments, came out in galactic standard as something approximating Kethverath, which doesn't translate cleanly into any single human language, but the closest working equivalent, according to the VETH linguistic database, was a compound concept meaning, the last warning before the end of mercy. Which I know how that sounds. It sounds like the kind of thing that gets carved on the entrance to a haunted temple in an old adventure story. It sounds theatrical. It sounds like someone was being dramatic. Except precursor sites didn't do theatrical. Everything that had ever been found at any precursor installation was functional, practical, purpose-built. No decoration for its own sake. No symbolism without utility. Whatever was carved into those walls was there for a reason, and that reason was to communicate something specific to whoever eventually found it. They were warning us. I just didn't understand yet what they were warning us about. The next 2 weeks were a peculiar kind of tense. The station administration had put Corridor Cluster 7 on restricted access, which annoyed several of the VETH researchers who had other projects running in adjacent sections. And a small team of us had been quietly pulled into a new working group tasked with continuing the decode. The Quorum of Sealed Records sent an observer. Her name was Counselor Isaveth, a senior VETH official, probably 300 years old by my rough estimate, with the particular stillness of very old VETH who have learned to conserve their reactions. She sat in on our sessions, asked precise questions, and wrote things down in a ledger she kept physically locked. Old school. The kind of paranoid physical security that told you someone was worried about network interception. I liked her immediately, which felt strange given that she was clearly there to monitor us. The decode was slow work because the molecular signal wasn't uniform. Different sections of wall had different density patterns, different encoding depths. It was like trying to read a book where someone had written the chapters in different inks on different papers, and then laminated them all together. We had to isolate each distinct layer before the translation algorithms could make sense of it. What we were building, piece by piece, was a warning document. The precursors, whoever they were, whatever they were, those vast and now absent architects of impossible structures, had apparently encountered something they considered worth warning about, not just worth noting. Worth encoding in the molecular bedrock of a station that was clearly designed to last for timescales that made human civilization look like a coffee break. They were serious about this warning. They wanted it to survive. What they were warning about was called, and I'm going to give you the full translated compound term because I think it matters, Keth Verathmail, which our working translation rendered as the keeper of last silences, or alternatively, and this was the Veth linguist's preferred reading, the one who answers the end of patience. And it lived or had lived or was contained in sublevel 19 of Vorath 9. Let me be honest with you about something. When I first heard the words sublevel 19, they didn't mean anything special to me. Vorath 9 had 23 designated sublevels. I'd worked in sublevels 4, 5, and 7. I knew colleagues who worked in 8 and 11. Sublevel 19 was listed in the station schematic as uninhabited structural assessment pending, which was the kind of notation that could mean anything from we haven't gotten around to inspecting it yet, to we sent someone to look at it once and they came back with a headache. I didn't know at the time that structural assessment pending was a designation that had been placed on sublevel 19 before humanity had achieved interstellar flight, that it had been on every version of the station documentation for as long as the hegemony had maintained a presence there, that no one had ever gone down to sublevel 19, not once, not to inspect it, not to retrieve anything, not even to run passive sensor sweeps. Not because they forgot, because the Veth who first established the research presence at Vorath 9 40 years ago had found the same encoded warning in the walls of an upper corridor, run their own partial decode, understood enough of it to be alarmed, and quietly decided that the best policy was to stay away from sublevel 19 and not discuss it in any official capacity. Counselor Iseveth told me this herself, about 3 weeks into the working group sessions, late one station night when most of the team had gone to rest, and it was just the two of us and the cold blue light of the corridor and the hum of the translation systems. We knew, she said, not apologetically. The very old Veth don't apologize easily, just as a statement of fact. We understood enough of the warning to know that whatever is in that chamber should not be disturbed. Then why didn't you seal the station? Why maintain a research presence at all? She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes, Veth eyes, are dark, almost black, with a faint iridescent ring that becomes more visible when they're processing something complex. Her eyes did that shimmer. Because the station itself is too valuable, she said, and because we believed the containment was stable. Whatever the precursors placed in that chamber, whatever they put there or left there, or, she paused, chose her words carefully, whatever they contained there, the station's own systems appeared to be maintaining the seal, passively, without any active intervention from us. Appeared to be, I said. Appeared to be, she repeated. Past tense, Dr. Vasquez, is not a construction I use carelessly. I asked her what had changed. She looked at her ledger, opened it, looked at what was written there. Your frequency analysis, she said. The scan you ran on the corridor walls during your research. It took me a moment to understand what she was saying. My scan didn't go anywhere near sublevel 19, I said. I was in corridor cluster 7. That's at least 12 levels above. The station's internal structure doesn't follow the spatial logic the schematic suggests, Iseveth said, which was information I technically already knew and had somehow failed to apply to this specific situation. Many of the designated sublevels are not vertically arranged in the way the numbering implies. Sublevel 19 has several nodes that extend into the structural material of the corridor cluster. Molecular nodes, very deep, very old. The cold in the corridor suddenly felt more personal. My spectral frequency scan, I said slowly. It went into the walls. It was a deep penetration scan because the encoding was in the molecular substrate, not on the surface. Yes, and the frequency it emitted to read those molecular structures. Matched, Isabeth said, to within 4 decimal points, a specific resonance frequency that is detailed in the lower sections of the precursor warning document. A frequency explicitly listed as, she looked at her ledger again, as the one stimulus that would be interpreted by the containment chamber's passive sensing systems as an intentional activation signal. The silence between us lasted a long time. I woke it up, I said. Isabeth didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was very level. What you did, she said carefully, is send a signal that the containment system interpreted as authorization to begin the waking protocol. Whether the entity within the chamber is already fully conscious, partially roused, or simply in an altered state of dormancy, we don't yet know. What we do know is that 3 days ago, for the first time in 40 years of passive monitoring, the energy signature from sublevel 19 changed. Changed how? She closed the ledger. It increased, she said, by a factor of approximately 900. Here is where I have to be careful, because I want to tell you what happened next accurately. And accurately means admitting that for about 2 days after that conversation, I was not in a useful mental state. I'm not going to dress it up. I sat in my bunk and I stared at the ceiling of my quarters, and I thought about the fact that I had, through a completely routine research procedure conducted in good faith, apparently activated the waking sequence of something that an ancient civilization that could build structures lasting millions of years had considered worth sealing away. That's a specific kind of horror that's hard to describe. It isn't the shock of immediate danger. It's something more like the feeling of realizing that a thing you did in the past has already set in motion a consequence you can't stop, and all that's left is to find out what that consequence is. I talked to Ewan. He was trying to stay calm and mostly managing it. He said the right things, that we had a strong team, that the hegemony had been notified, that additional personnel were being dispatched, that there were protocols. He said protocols a lot. I appreciated the effort. I also talked to a human engineer named Recto Ibarra who had been at the station for 3 years and knew the physical structure better than anyone else on the human team. Recto was from Lagos, built like someone who had played rugby in university and never quite stopped, and had the personality of a person who had decided somewhere in his 30s that panic was an inefficiency he couldn't afford. He was the most calming person on the station to be around during those 2 days, mostly because he never pretended things were fine, and he never pretended things were hopeless either. You want to know what I think? Recto said. We were in the small common room that the human contingent used. It had been fitted with Terran standard chairs and lighting, a small courtesy the station administration had extended when the team expanded. I think whatever is down there has been asleep for a long time, and I think the precursors left that warning because they knew something like this might happen, and I think if they just wanted it dead, they would have killed it. They contained it, I said. Right, which means they made a choice. There was a reason they contained it instead of destroying it. We don't know what that reason is yet. That's not exactly comforting. No, he agreed, but it's information, and information is what we work with. On the 51st day of my assignment, which was 9 days after my conversation with Isabeth, and the worst 9 days of my life up to that point, the working group completed enough of the translation to understand the actual content of the precursor warning. I'm going to tell you what it said, or at least the working translation, because precursor compound language doesn't render cleanly into galactic standard, and galactic standard doesn't render cleanly into any human language, so by the time it reaches you, it's already 3 layers of interpretation away from the source. But this is as close as we could get. The document began with what the Veth linguists identified as a statement of context, something like, "To those who find this record, you are not the first, and you may not survive to be the last. Read completely before taking any action. This instruction is not a formality." Then it described what was contained in the chamber. The entity the precursors called Keth Varath Male was not, as some of us had half hoped, a machine or a weapon system or even an animal in any recognizable sense. It was a being, fully conscious, capable of reasoning, with a form of subjective experience that the precursors considered equivalent in depth to their own. It was also, and the precursor language strained to express this, or at least our translation strained to render what the precursor language was expressing. It was also the last of its kind. There had once been many of them. The precursor document didn't say what they were called, or what they looked like, or where they had come from. What it said was that they had coexisted with the precursors for a vast span of time. A number was given in precursor counting units that our team's best estimate placed somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million years, and that during most of that time the coexistence had been, if not warm, at least stable. Then something had happened. The document was damaged in those sections. The molecular encoding was disrupted, degraded, whether by time or by something more deliberate we couldn't tell. What we could recover was fragmentary, but the fragments were enough to understand the shape of what had happened. The other beings, HFY's kind, had been destroyed. Not in a war, not by the precursors. Destroyed by something else, something the document referred to only as the deep silence, which our translation team argued about for hours and eventually rendered as something like the forgetting that moves through space, though none of us were satisfied with that rendering. HFY had survived, alone the last one. And this was the part of the document that required the most careful reading, because the precursor language shifted register here in a way that suggested they were being extremely precise about something they found difficult to express. Then the being had changed. Not physically, not in its form or its basic nature, but in its relationship to the universe around it. The precursor document said, as best we could translate it, when the last of a kind understands that it is the last, and understands why, and understands that the understanding itself cannot be shared with any who would fully comprehend it, then the creature becomes something that was not there before. There was a term for this state. In our working translation, we called it the awakened grief that exceeds the capacity for peace. The precursors had spent what our calculations suggested was somewhere around 30,000 years trying to understand what HFY had become, what it was capable of, whether it was stable or whether its continued existence posed a threat. Their conclusion, the part of the document that was most complete, most carefully encoded, most clearly intended to be the part that anyone finding this record would absolutely understand, was expressed in a way that I think about often, even now, years later. It is not dangerous because it wishes to harm. It is dangerous because it is patient, and it is patient because it has nothing left to lose, and the patience of a creature with nothing left to lose directed at a universe that took everything from it. This is the most dangerous thing we have encountered. Not its strength, which is considerable. Not its intelligence, which exceeds our own by measures we cannot fully calculate. Its patience, the waiting. And what it might choose to do when it decides the waiting is finished. We have contained it not to protect ourselves, but to protect the universe from what it might become if it is left to wait long enough. And we have done this with its knowledge. It knows it is contained. It agreed to this. But its agreement came with one condition. If it is woken, truly woken, fully woken by an external signal rather than rising naturally, then the agreement is void. Not because it will be angry, because the agreement was based on a period of waiting it chose for itself. To be woken before that period ends is, in its understanding, a breach of the arrangement. To the beings who sent the waking signal, it knows who you are. It knew the moment the signal arrived. It has been asleep for a very long time, but its awareness of the space around it did not sleep with it. If you are still in the station, leave now. Not because it will certainly harm you, but because the first thing a creature woken before its time experiences is disorientation. And the second thing it experiences is the full weight of every moment it has endured since it became the last. And the third thing is recognition of who broke the waiting. Leave while it is still in the third thing. The fourth thing is judgment. The translation finished at approximately 4 in the morning, station time. Counselor Isavith read the final sections twice. Then she stood up from the table, moved to the communications panel on the wall, and sent a single coded message through the station's emergency network. It went to every department head simultaneously. It said in Galactic Standard, which everyone on the station read regardless of their native language. Voluntary evacuation of Vorath 9 is now recommended. Personnel who choose to remain do so with full awareness that the situation in sublevel 19 may not be controllable through any available intervention. Transportation assets are being repositioned. First shuttle available in 3 hours. Not mandatory. Recommended. I've thought about that word choice a lot since then. Isabeth was an extremely careful woman. She didn't use imprecise language. If she said recommended instead of mandatory, it was because she'd thought through the distinction and decided it mattered. I think it was because making it mandatory, issuing an emergency evacuation order, would have required her to explain the reason. And the reason was something she wasn't sure the hegemony was ready to have officially on record. There was a creature in sublevel 19 that was older than most currently living civilizations. That was possibly more intelligent than anyone in this station or possibly anyone in the hegemony, that had agreed to wait out its grief in containment and had now been woken up before the wait was finished. And the reason it had been woken up was that a human researcher had run a routine spectral analysis without knowing that the frequency her scanner used would be interpreted as a deliberate activation signal. Humanity had been full hegemony members for 60 years. We were still the new species, the one everyone was politely uncertain about. And we had just woken up what the precursors considered the most dangerous thing they had ever encountered. I didn't leave on the first shuttle. I want to be clear that this wasn't heroism. It wasn't even particularly rational. I stayed because I was the one who had sent the signal, and I didn't think I could live with myself if I ran without understanding what I'd done. That's not the same thing as being brave. It's closer to being unable to fully process the magnitude of what's happening and therefore unable to move. Recto stayed too, but Recto staying made more sense. He knew the station's physical systems better than anyone, and if something needed to be done about the structural situation, he was the most useful person to have on hand. Ewan left on the first shuttle. I didn't blame him. He had a daughter. Priorities are priorities. About 140 people left in that first wave. About 160 stayed, for reasons that varied. Some because they genuinely thought the situation would be manageable, some because they had ongoing experiments they couldn't just walk away from, some because they were curious, some because they were afraid of looking afraid, and some because, like Recto, they had specific skills that seemed relevant. Counselor Isabeth stayed, obviously. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. The second shuttle was scheduled for 6 hours later. The change in sublevel 19's energy signature happened 4 hours into that window. I was in the main monitoring room with Recto and a Veth technician named Sarvith when the readouts shifted. We'd been watching the sublevel 19 sensors with the particular concentration of people who are waiting for something they can't stop and don't fully understand. The energy signature didn't spike. It didn't explode outward or register as some kind of violent burst. It simply clarified. That's the only word that fits. The signal had been a complex, layered, almost static-filled pattern for days, like something half-assembled, or like a radio signal from too far away. And then over the course of about 12 minutes it became clean, coherent, a single clear frequency. Sarvith said something in rapid Veth that I didn't catch, then repeated it in Galactic Standard. "It's awake," he said, "fully awake." Recto looked at the readouts. He had this habit of tilting his head slightly when he was thinking hard, just slightly, like his brain needed a different angle. He tilted his head. "The sensors are reading a structured signal," he said. "Not random, not biological noise, structured. Is it communicating? Is that a communication frequency?" Sarvith ran the analysis. Came back 3 minutes later looking like he'd been told something he wasn't sure he believed. "It's not broadcasting outward," he said slowly. "The signal is internal. Self-directed, it's not trying to communicate with us." "Then what is it doing?" I asked. Sarvith looked at the data for another moment. "If I had to characterize it using any framework I know," he said, "I would say it is taking stock. It is oriented inward. It is assessing its own state." We watched the monitors. For about 20 minutes, the signal stayed internal, coherent, and steady. Then it changed again, subtly, the way a tone changes when the source of it turns to face you. "It knows we're watching," Recto said, not alarmed, just stating it. "Yes," Sarvith agreed. "And it knows we know it knows we're watching," I added, "because once you start down that recursive path, you might as well finish it." "Almost certainly," Sarvith said. The signal from sublevel 19 held steady at its new frequency. And then through the station's own internal communication system, not through any terminal, not through any interface any of us had activated, but through the ambient system that usually carried maintenance alerts and environmental notifications. A sound came. Not words, not any language any of us recognized. A tone, single, sustained, low enough to feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then silence. Then, after a pause that lasted exactly as long as the tone itself. 2 tones, slightly different from the first. Recto and I looked at each other. "It's using a counting sequence," he said. "Why?" I asked. He thought about it, tilted his head. "Because it wants to know if we understand what counting is," he said. "It's the oldest possible opener. It's the thing you say to a species you've never spoken to before when you want to know if they're capable of communication. It's its first contact protocol." "It's running first contact protocol," I said, "with a station full of species that have been part of an interstellar civilization for thousands of years." "Not with them," Recto said. His voice was very quiet. "With us, look at the signal directionality, Dara. That tone didn't broadcast throughout the station." I looked. The signal origin pointed, with precision the system normally couldn't achieve, directly at the monitoring room we were in. Directly at us. It was talking to the humans. What happened in the next 6 hours is something I have given testimony about 3 times. Once to the Hegemony Council, once to a closed session of the Quorum of Sealed Records, and once to a Terran Senate Oversight Subcommittee that met in private and released a version of my account that was, shall we say, significantly edited. I'll tell you the real version here. We responded to the counting sequence. Recto did mostly. He had an instinct for this that I think came from somewhere in his engineering background, the part of his brain that thought in terms of signals and responses and establishing common ground through shared logic. He used the station's ambient system to transmit our own counting sequence back. 3 tones, then 4, then 5. The response was immediate. Not tones this time. Something more complex. A pattern that took our systems about 20 minutes to partially decode, and that Sarvith identified as a form of mathematical notation. The kind of universal language that anyone working with information theory understands, because the relationships it describes are true in any universe regardless of what biology produced the thinker. It was asking, in the most fundamental possible mathematical language, whether we understood something specific about prime numbers. "It's testing us," I said. "It's checking," Recto corrected. "There's a difference. Testing implies judgment in advance. Checking is it just wants to know what it's working with." We answered, we kept answering. Back and forth for 2 hours, in a mathematical dialogue that got progressively more sophisticated with each exchange, until we were somewhere in the territory of information theory and signal encoding that was pushing the limits of what Recto and I could follow in real time, though our systems were keeping up. And then it stopped. The mathematical exchange just stopped mid-sequence. Not abruptly, it completed a unit, a full logical statement, and then simply didn't continue. We waited. 3 minutes of silence. Then Counselor Isevith walked into the monitoring room. I hadn't called her. I didn't know how she knew to come. She simply appeared in the doorway, looked at our monitoring screens, looked at the readouts, and sat down in the empty chair at the far end of the console as if she had an appointment. "It has made a decision," she said. "How do you know?" I asked. "The signal frequency shifted," she said. "The inward orientation I was watching from the secondary station, it is now directed outward, at this room." She looked at me. "It wants to speak, not in mathematics, in language." "In whose language?" Recto asked. Isevith's answer was quiet and absolutely certain. "Yours," she said. "It wants to speak in a human language. It has been listening to our communications since it woke. It has been learning." The silence in the monitoring room was total. "It's been awake for 6 hours," I said. "Yes. It learned a language in 6 hours. From passive interception of our communications, yes." I thought about that, the full weight of it. Whatever was in sublevel 19 had come out of a sleep that had lasted. We still didn't know how long, but the lower estimate based on the precursor documentation was somewhere in the range of 100,000 years. It had come out of that sleep, oriented itself, engaged in a mathematical dialogue to assess the cognitive capabilities of the beings around it. And then, deciding that mathematical notation wasn't sufficient for what it wanted to communicate, had spent the remaining time absorbing human language from ambient station transmissions. In 6 hours, not our whole language, obviously. Not the depth of it, the nuance, the 10,000 years of accumulated meaning, but enough. The tone came through the ambient system again, different from before, shaped differently, and then underneath it something that was unmistakably an attempt at structure, syntax, grammar in formation. The voice that came through the station's ambient system sounded like no voice I had ever heard. Not frightening, exactly, though it was that too. More like the sound of something that understood the concept of a voice without having had one in a very long time, or possibly ever, and was constructing one the way you construct a tool, with purpose, with precision, with the kind of focused intelligence that doesn't need to have done something before to do it well. It said, in English, choosing English specifically, I think, because I had been the one to run the original scan, and it had identified me as the source of the signal that woke it. You called, you did not know you were calling. I am aware of the distinction. I am choosing to treat it as relevant. A pause. You are the young kind, the ones who came late. I have not spoken with your kind before. In the time before my sleep, you were not yet a consideration. Another pause, longer. I have questions, I will ask them. I will wait for your answers, I have practice with waiting. Something in those last 4 words, the way the constructed voice shaped them, the frequency that sat underneath them like a foundation, made the hair on my arms stand up, not from fear. From recognition of something immense and heavy, something that had been carried for a very long time. I think I understood in that moment what the precursor document had been trying to say. The waiting wasn't emptiness. The waiting wasn't passive. The waiting was something this creature had done consciously, actively, every moment of every year of however long it had been in that chamber. It had been present in its containment. It had been aware. And underneath the awareness was everything it had lost, and the weight of the time it had spent knowing it, and the grief that the precursor linguists had struggled so hard to describe because no language they had was built to hold something that large. I had woken that up. Me, Dara Vasquez from Sao Paulo with a master's degree and a spectral frequency scanner, and a habit of working late. I took a breath, and I answered it. My name is Dara, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I'm the one who woke you. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm sorry. The silence that followed was 10 seconds long. When the voice came back, it was different. Not in its construction, still that same careful, built quality. Different in the way a face changes when something lands on it. You are apologizing, it said, for the act of waking me. Yes. Your kind apologizes for things done without intent. When the consequences are serious, yes. Another pause. This is unfamiliar, it said. The ones who put me here did not apologize, they explained. They reasoned. They made the case for why the arrangement was necessary. They did not apologize. Maybe they should have, I said. The pause that followed was longer, 15 seconds, 20. Recto was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Isevith was still. Sarvith had his hands flat on the console in front of him and was absolutely not moving. Perhaps, the voice said finally, perhaps they should have. A shift in the signal, something that felt, if a signal can feel, like a long exhale. You said you did not know. I have considered this. The mathematical exchange suggested that your kind operates with significant gaps in your knowledge of your own environment. You were unaware of the encoding in the walls. You were unaware of the frequency. You were unaware of me. We were, I said. Most of us. Some people knew there was something in sublevel 19. They didn't tell us. A very brief pause. Why not? This was the question I hadn't wanted to reach, because the answer was complicated in ways that made humanity look bad. But I'd started this conversation by apologizing, which meant I'd committed to a certain kind of honesty. Because, I said, they were afraid that if they told us we'd want to investigate, and we probably would have. We tend to want to know things, even when knowing things is dangerous. The longest pause yet. Then, yes, said the voice from sublevel 19. I remember that about your kind, from before. I have been watching your transmissions for the past hours. You are noisier than I remembered. More languages, more arguments, more questions directed at each other. You did not change that much. Something shifted in the room. It took me a second to understand what it was. It was the realization, landing on all of us at slightly different moments, that when this creature said, "I remember your kind from before," it meant from before the current era of human civilization. From before we had science, maybe. From before we had writing. It remembered us from when we were still figuring out fire. "You have grown considerably," it said. "That was not inevitable. Many young kinds did not." "How many did you see?" Recto asked. He said it quietly, not quite at the communication system, but the signal came from everywhere, and it caught the question anyway. "Many," it said simply. "I watched them from here, in the time before I slept. Many young kinds began, not all continued. The universe is not arranged for the comfort of small things." "No," Recto agreed, "it isn't." "You are still small," it said. "In scale of time, in scale of reach. You have 60 years in the larger conversation. I know this from your transmissions. You joined the group of species that talks to each other, and you have been there for 60 of your years." "That's right. I have been in this chamber," it said, "for longer than the oldest species in that group has existed." The math on that was staggering. The oldest hegemony member species, the Veth, had a recorded civilizational history of about 40,000 years. If this creature had been in that chamber longer than that. "I am not telling you this to impress you," it said, and there was something in the signal frequency underneath those words that might have been humor, or might have been something too old and complex to fully map onto human emotional categories. "I am telling you so that you understand my perspective when I ask you the question I have been preparing since I woke." "What question?" I asked. The signal from sublevel 19 steadied, held absolutely still for a moment, the way something holds still when it is gathering itself for something that matters. "Why are you still here?" I blinked. "I'm sorry. The warning was issued. The evacuation was recommended. Many of your people left. You did not." A pause. "I identified you specifically from the frequency analysis. I know you are the source of the waking signal. You know this too. You apologized for it. And yet you are still here in proximity to a thing you have been told is dangerous, that you woke accidentally, that you cannot control." "Why did you stay?" it pressed. "I want to understand. The mathematics told me the shape of your reasoning capabilities. The language told me the structure of your communication. But this choice tells me something neither of those things could." I thought about what Recto had said in the common room, about information being what we work with. "Because I wanted to know what I'd done," I said. "Because running away from the consequences of something I caused it felt like a failure of responsibility, even if I didn't do it intentionally." "You take responsibility for accidents," it said. "We try to, even when the consequence is something far beyond your capacity to address. Especially then, I think." The signal held steady. "Then that is not nothing. In my experience, which is considerable, willingness to stay with the consequence of an act regardless of whether the act was intentional, that is not a quality that is common among young kinds. It is not common among old kinds either, if I am honest." Something shifted in the air of the monitoring room, not physically, not in any way a sensor would have caught. But something shifted. "I have been thinking," the voice said, "about the arrangement, the one I made with the ones who built this station, about what my agreement was contingent upon, and whether contingency still applies to a being I did not choose to wake, from a kind I did not know to expect." I waited. "The agreement specified," it said, "that a deliberate waking signal voided the arrangement. The signal you sent was not deliberate. The document in the walls, the warning, accounts for many things. It does not account for a species that investigates without knowing what it is investigating." "You are a novel case," it said, and the signal frequency underneath those words was unmistakably something that functioned like dry amusement. "The precursors who built this station were comprehensive, thorough. They accounted for a great many scenarios, but they were not, apparently, prepared for a young species to activate the waking sequence by running a standard research scan. To be clear, they built the encoding into the walls to warn people away. They encoded it at a depth that required active penetrating analysis to find. The assumption was that anyone deep enough in their analysis to penetrate that far would first read the warning encoded on the outer layer. A pause. Your team found the outer layer encoding, and were in the process of translating it when the inner layer scan was already completed. We were working fast, I said a little weakly. You were, it agreed. Your kind does that, moves fast. Acts before the full picture is assembled. From a certain angle, this is a flaw. From another angle, it is why you are still here when many young kinds are not. The ambient system held the signal steady. I have made a decision, it said. I will tell you what it is, and then I will ask you something in return. I held my breath. Around me, Recto had gone very still, and Sarvith was watching the monitors with the intense focus of someone who wanted to record every detail and also very much did not want to miss the moment when things became something other than they currently were. Isavith, in her chair at the far end of the console, had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. Whatever she was thinking, she was keeping it at a depth I couldn't read. The voice from sub-level 19 spoke. I will not void the arrangement, it said. The waking was not intentional. The source of the signal did not know what she was doing. These are relevant facts. I choose to treat them as relevant. The arrangement stands. Something in the room eased. I felt it in my chest, in the particular way that tension releases when you've been holding it so long you forgot it was there. But the voice continued. However, it said, remaining in the arrangement requires something from me that was easier before I was woken. In my sleep, the waiting did not require effort. I was not conscious of the time passing. I simply waited in a state that was not waking and not dying, and the time moved as time does, and I did not feel it. Now I am awake, and now I will feel every moment of the remaining time, and the remaining time is a pause long. The signal frequency underneath those last words did something I don't have language for. It wasn't sadness, exactly, though it was in that family. It was more like the sound a very old structure makes when additional weight is added to it, not collapsing, not even close to collapsing, but speaking honestly about what it is bearing. I have one request, it said. Not a condition, not a threat, a request, you may refuse it. What is it? I asked. Talk to me, said the last of its kind, from inside a chamber that had held it for longer than human civilization had existed. Not now, not continuously, but sometimes, when your work brings you near. Your kind is here in this station, doing what your kind does, pushing into things you don't yet understand, asking questions that outpace your answers, making noise and arguments and discoveries. I have been listening for the past hours. It is, the signal frequency did that thing again. It is not unpleasant. I have been alone for a very long time. The kind of alone that I was that is hard to explain. I was not in silence. The universe is not silent, but there was no voice, no reasoning thing that spoke with intent to me about the things that minds think about. Your kind is unreasonable and fast and curious, and you make mistakes with consequences larger than you realize, and you apologize for them even when you couldn't have known better. A pause. I would like occasionally to hear from you. That is all. The monitoring room was absolutely silent. Then Recto made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. He shook his head slowly, the way he did when something had surprised him at a level he hadn't prepared for. You kept 100,000 years of loneliness and you just want someone to talk to, he said, quietly, not quite at the ambient system, but again, it caught it. That is a simplified rendering, the voice said, but it is not inaccurate. I looked at Recto, he looked at me. I turned back to the communication system. Okay, I said. Okay. Yes, we'll talk to you. I'll come back. I'm an archaeologist, which means I spend most of my time trying to understand things that are very old. I think this might be the most relevant thing I've ever worked on. The signal from sublevel 19 shifted, just slightly, the way a frequency shifts when the source of it changes. If I had to give it a human name, I would call it relief. I am aware, it said, that your kind has a habit of naming things. I no longer have the name my kind used. I have not had that name for longer than I can express in a language you would follow. You may give me one if that is useful to you. I thought about it. Can I have some time to think about it? You may have as much time as you require, it said. I have learned to be patient. The second shuttle left on schedule. About 60 more people were on it. The remaining 100 or so, the ones who stayed, for whatever reasons, went back to their work. Their experiments, their routines, with the particular focused normalcy of people who have decided that the most useful thing they can do in an extraordinary situation is be ordinary inside it. I went back to corridor cluster 7. I sat on the floor where I'd sat when the pattern clicked, where the frequency analysis had run and returned numbers that felt familiar in the way that numbers feel familiar when they are about to change everything. The wall in front of me held its engravings, the surface ones, the decorative-looking ones that were apparently almost secondary to the real message underneath. I could read parts of them now with what we'd translated. Parts of the warning I had read only after I'd already tripped it. There was a line near the base of the wall, near where I'd been sitting the night of the scan, that I hadn't been able to parse before, and that, with the translation work done, I could now render. It said to the one who finds this by looking closely at the things others passed by, the looking was always the point. Be careful what you find. Be honest with what you woke. It was waiting to be found by someone willing to stay. I sat with that for a long time. The cold of the corridor settled around me the way it always did, patient and complete. From somewhere very far below, down through 12 levels of impossible precursor architecture, through the nodes that extended into the walls like roots, through whatever the precursors had built to last millions of years and had so far succeeded at lasting, I thought I could feel the faintest hum. Not heard exactly. Felt. The presence of a frequency that was now awake and directed and no longer entirely alone. I stayed there until the station moved into its morning cycle and the lights shifted and the sounds of 300, 140, now people beginning their day filtered through the corridors. Then I took out my tablet, opened a new document and started writing.